Hello, welcome to Gardener's World, and welcome to the glories of the great white cherry, your Taihaku. This doesn't flower for very long, just a few days, and it's very easily battered by wind and rain. So when it is at its best, and you've got it just at its best today, it's just a glory. And for a few days, when the sun shines in spring, it is the most wonderful thing in any garden. Now, coming up on today's programme, Carol reveals her plans for an ambitious show garden that she's designing for the RHS Hampton Court Palace Garden Festival.
I'm terrified, actually. I've never done anything on that sort of scale, and I'm so looking forward to it, even though I'm trembling at the prospect.
We meet a man who takes a scientific approach to gardening for wildlife.
My sort of ethos on all of this is that where we all live was once a wild natural habitat. And so I guess there is that onus on us to put something back.
With a ban on peating compost on the way, Arit looks at what that means for the industry and gardeners alike.
There are lots of new peat-free growing medias out there that are significantly shifted with science input into them, which means that they can still grow very good quality plants for us gardeners.
And I will be focusing on peas, both savoury and sweet. Good dogs, good dogs. This is the dry garden, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, the reason why we call it a dry garden is because it drains much better than anywhere else in the whole garden. That's because we have a very thin layer of soil over the top of sandstone. So that changes the way that we grow the same plants in other parts of the garden, and also gives us an opportunity to grow some plants that just won't grow elsewhere. For example, this euphorbia. This is Euphorbia coraceus, which if I grew this in the jewel garden, it would be 50% bigger and flop all over the place and then would rot. Here, absolutely perfect. And there's Nautia macedonica, which we do grow elsewhere, grows completely differently here. It stays short and fairly compact. It doesn't need supporting in any way. And I'm going to add sedums. Now, sedums actually are now called Telefion, but like so many name changes that are categorizing them for scientific purposes, essentially they haven't changed at all, and I have to say I'll always think of them as sedums. And these are essentially succulents that cope very well with drought. So for example, if you look at these ones over here, they're nice and compact and they will stay like that. Now I'm going to plant these purple ones around the olive which seems to have survived winter and the cold, which is great. This is a variety called Purple Emperor, and like all sedums, the flowers are fantastic for attracting butterflies later in summer. You can see it's really gritty and stony. I can just pop that in there like that. There we go. Sedums are succulents, and that means, like all succulents, they store some water in their foliage, which they can draw upon when it's dry. So unless you actively see the leaves wilting, there's no need to water them. And by and large, in this country, there's enough rain to see them through any amount of drought. Now this year, Carol is creating a show garden at the Royal Horticultural Society's Hampton Court Palace Garden Festival. And we went down to Glebe Cottage to see how her preparations were going.
Every so often, it's just lovely to come out and look at your garden. I love my garden. Over the last 45 years or so, with a lot of help, I've made this garden into what it is now. It wasn't always like this, mind. Look at this. It was a bare field, except it was full of weeds, absolutely masses of them. Gradually, over all those 45 years, I've worked on the garden, and I've got to know it really quite intimately. Well, this garden's going to go on and on, I hope, but this year I'm going to make a new garden. I'm not moving out, the house isn't for sale, nor the garden, but I am going to Hampton Court to make an enormous garden. The RHS have invited me there, and I'm terrified, actually. I've never done anything on that sort of scale, and I'm so looking forward to it, even though I'm trembling at the prospect. Well, here is my master plan, or actually it's just a folder with all sorts of bits of paper that have been to do with designing this garden. And you can see how late at night I was working, because I've spilt tea all over everything as well. But initially, this is what I came up with. It's what you call simple, not very posh, is it? My first design, and it's this big oval shape, and I've got 6 completely different areas here. So you walk in and there's a bog garden here, there's a raised bit with trees, a little native hedge, there's a meadow area divided into 3 sort of big beds, and then on the other side, once you've turned round and come back the other way, there's more a mountain, and then over here there's a seaside bit, and in the middle that oval's repeated, and this is a veg garden. I wanted this garden to sort of engender 2 different ideas. First ethos is actually growing your own plants, propagating them. They're all straightforward things which everybody can grow, but they're informed by the second part of the ethos, which is whatever your garden's like, whether it's dry and sunny, whether it's damp, whatever it is, have a look. Follow nature's lead and see where that takes you. Look at the kind of plants that will thrive in the kind of natural habitat that's most akin to what you've got in your own garden. And just to whet your appetite, here's an artist's impression of the garden I'm going to create. Above all else, I want this garden to inspire you. My own garden here is going to be my inspiration, if you like, for my Hampton Court garden. And as you can see, this is a shady area. Now it's going to be much, much smaller, a really edited version of this. But I'm going to use beech trees out in the distance, and they kind of set the tone for the whole thing. But at the moment, they're just skeletal, and all the plants that are underneath that are growing right under the trees are really taking advantage of that. They're springtime plants, and there's lots of colour from hellebores, from trilliums, but by the time summer comes, this will be a quiet green space, and that's exactly what I want under my beech trees at Hampton Court. Although I've got to buy lots of the plants in for Hampton Court, I'll also be taking a load of plants that I've grown here. And in one part of the garden, as you walk past a veggie bit, there's a little triangle, and in it I'm going to have 3 tall pots. And in those pots, I'm going to have sweet peas. And the sweet peas I'm going to have are one called Kupani. It's one of the oldest sweet peas. It's almost a straight species. It's been grown in this country for hundreds and hundreds of years. I've got some sweet pea seed here, and I've soaked it overnight. Now, when you turf the seeds out of the packet, they're quite hard, quite solid. And if you soak them, it allows the seed to swell, and it makes it easier for the seed to germinate. So I'm just going to put on the top, press it in gently. And then I'll just gently squeeze that compost in, and I shall water them from the top. I'll sprinkle a bit of grit on the top of here first, just to make sure that when those new shoots emerge, there's no chance of them starting to rot, and it'll keep any weeds out of there, and it will also retain moisture within each of these modules too. Although it's really tempting to be lured by all these gorgeous coloured packets, there's nothing that beats saving your own seed, actually going out into your garden and collecting it at the right time, of course. So here I've got Ami. This is a beautiful umbel, really quite tall, and it's going to play a big leading role, I think, in the meadow bit of my garden. Those are all old seed heads from Ami that I collected late last autumn. And if I just use my finger and thumb, I've probably got 100 seeds on this bit of paper, which is quite enough. I'm going to winnow. All the dross is coming off there, and I'm going to be left with almost pure seed. Just look at that. You've got a whole garden full of plants there. And then, instead of watering it with a watering can from above, I'm going to put it into a shallow tray of water and let it pull up that water. And when I take it out, then that means that water will drag the seed down, so it's in intimate contact with the compost. And those are the conditions that are going to make my seed grow.
Come on. Come on. Yeah. We will be paying another visit to Carol later on in the programme. Now, the ground has been too wet to sow peas until now. Peas are legumes, so keeping a very basic rotation in a vegetable garden, you have the legumes in one plot, then you have brassicas in another and roots in the third, and you rotate them every year, and legumes fix nitrogen from the air and leave some in the ground, and then the brassicas can take up that nitrogen. Now, having raked it over, I use this for peas. I'm not quite sure what it's originally for, but it's perfect for growing peas because ideally you make a broad, shallow drill, about 1 inch or 2 deep. So you have a very flat trench. Now I've got a drawer of peas here, some of which are left over from last year, and peas are one of those seeds that keep quite well. So I've got a pea I particularly like, Hurst Greenshaft, an old-fashioned pea, not too tall, quite short. Lots of pods full of lovely succulent peas. And of course, since freezing, we've taken fresh peas for granted. But actually, for centuries, most peas were grown to be dried, and it was good winter food. But fresh peas were a treat, and I think they still are. Grown in the garden, picked, open the pod, and either eat them there and then raw or cook them, nothing like it. Now, you grow them, doesn't matter what variety, in parallel rows, either side of the trench, with each pea a couple of inches apart. So you've got 2 lines running along. So having sown those, I'm just going to mark the spot just in case. I will write on it later, so that's 1 row, that's another. And just pull the soil back over them. And then we have the fancy bit. Peas are climbers, and you need to have something to support them, which is where pea sticks come in. These are the bushy bit of coppiced hazel. And of course you can use any material, it doesn't have to be hazel. Just prunings from the garden work well. And if you haven't got prunings, then netting will do. Any kind of support that the tendrils of the peas can cling on to. But I quite like the sort of structural, sculptural element. I also like the way that it doesn't waste anything. And it's completely renewable. Now, it is really important to keep peas well watered, so give them a good soak once you put in your support, and if it gets really dry, water them again, particularly when they flower. That's a critical time. And that way you should end up with pods full of lovely, fresh green peas, which should be round about July time. While I'm doing this, it's time to visit one of your gardens, and this one is in Holland.
Hello Gardeners World, and welcome to my urban garden in Amsterdam. My name's Carl and I'd like to show you around. As you can see, a barren wasteland overlooked by lots of houses, a dead cherry tree and large trees next door. The garden is semi-shade. Oh, this was my garden 15 months ago. My garden now looks like this. In this corner we have my little survivor. It was found on a skip with one leaf, dehydrated, and I brought it home, and 6 months later it is doing very well. It's a Cercis called Carolina Sweetheart. The leaves emerge this beautiful deep pink colour with burgundy splashes and then fade to produce these leaves that are mottled, sometimes almost pure white with just a tiny bit of green. Behind it are Alstroemeria, the variety is Saturn, and it is an extremely long flowering Alstroemeria. One of the main problems you have in a small garden is succession. So I try to plant things that I know will flower at different times, so that if I have to cut back, say, the Salvia cardona, which will go over very shortly, then I have other plants like blue lobelia coming through, which will give me the colour while the Salvia regenerates. Well, that's everything from me now. I hope you enjoy the look around my micro garden in Amsterdam.
I know that if you take on a garden that is just bare and empty and maybe concrete and slabs, that's very daunting. But Carl shows that you can transform it into something wonderful. We're going from one lot of peas to another because it's time to plant out sweet peas, which obviously we grow for their flowers. The secret of sweet peas is to get strong, healthy plants with a good root system into the ground before it gets too hot and dry. Now, all of us who grew sweet peas last summer found that it was a disaster. They just hate really hot, dry weather. Now, this is a variety called Painted Lady that was sown at the end of January. And what I always do is I sow 3 seeds to a pot, but I plant out the whole pot at the base of its support. And you can see a nice root system there. They can stay in the pot for a little bit longer, but if I get them in the ground, they'll grow away. Nice rich soil, and pop that in the ground and push around. Always plant on the inside of any support, and that means you can water in the middle and the roots will make the most of the water. If you plant them on the outside, you have to water a much wider area. And watering is important. They must never be allowed to dry out. You will have to tie them in for the first month or so, and then the tendrils will be self-clinging and they should start flowering in June. And if we go on picking them, they'll go on flowering until October. Now, last summer we went to Malvern in Worcestershire to visit a garden where everything possible has been done to attract wildlife.
There's so much enjoyment that can be had by engaging with nature. What I want to do is to provide a space for nature in this garden and get the rewards from doing that for our own food production. My name is Dr. Duncan Westbury, and my philosophy on gardening is that every plant should have a purpose. So be it to provide food, to provide shelter, to provide habitat for a variety of species. Last year, this area was part of our existing lawn, and I decided to change all of that 4 months ago when I rotivated the existing lawn to basically knock back the grasses, and then created a seed bank, which I then sowed this Bumblebird mix. A Bumblebird mix is in the name, so it supports bumblebees during the summer months, but those bumblebees are then pollinating the flowers, which then go on to produce food for feeding the birds in the winter months. And I wanted to see with my own mix what I could achieve in the garden. So here we have mustard. And so the bees love this for its nectar, and then you'll see that the seed pods are then filling out, which will then provide food for the birds in those winter months. A key aspect of wildlife gardening is that you can be quite hands-off, and so since sowing this area, I haven't had to do anything. So I haven't had to water, I haven't had to put down any fertilisers, I've just left it to its own devices. And in just 4 months, this is what's been achieved. When we moved here, the lawn was traditionally cut very short. And so immediately I started raising the cutting height of the lawn, because that provides a much better habitat for many species. It's also good for capturing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The other bonus is that because those plants have got deeper roots, it means that during periods of low rainfall or drought, you will also find that your lawn keeps greener for longer. Now, July, August is a really good time to collect seed of wildflower species and grow on in your own garden. But the key thing to remember is that you do need permission, so please make sure you do that. You don't need to have these areas which are specifically for horticultural varieties. You can dot in the odd wildflower species amongst that. So meadow cranesbill is an excellent example of that. With very showy flowers, the Victorians used to grow this in their garden. So it's one which we tend to have lost to the more hardy geraniums, those horticultural varieties, but let's go back to nature and start using our native varieties. This is the part of the garden where we really do see the benefits of the biodiversity we're encouraging in the garden. This is my vegetable patch. So an important garden helper in our garden is the earwig. And so we do all we can to harness the power of the earwig to help us with the control of pests of our crops. It's vital you provide shelter for them. And so that's exactly what I have here on the runner bean cane. So this is a simple length of piping with a cap on top, but the important part is here. This is the corrugated cardboard. If you were to put one of these on your runner bean canes, you're unlikely to get earwigs moving in straight away. So what you need to do is to find somewhere where they're likely to move into. And I use our Victoria plum tree, which is loaded with earwigs. I will then put this into that Victoria plum tree, and maybe I'll get 12, 15 earwigs in there. And when I have an outbreak of aphids on the runner beans, I then move the earwig shelter onto the runner beans. And once their job is done, I then simply put the shelter back in the Victoria plum tree. One of my favourite helpers in the garden is not an insect, it's not a bird, it's not a mammal, it's actually a plant, and that plant is yellow rattle. So I did my PhD studying the benefits of using yellow rattle. One of the most common misconceptions is that it only feeds off of the grasses. Well, actually, it will feed off many wildflowers as well. One of its favourite hosts is clover, red clover, and that's because it gets nitrogen from that plant. Now, the reason it tends to reduce the growth and the abundance of the grasses is because when it's finding its host, it's more likely to encounter the roots of a grass, but it will benefit your wildflower area. By reducing the productivity of the area, you then allow more species to survive. This is my favourite area of our garden. It's our front garden. There used to be a very formal lawn. And so I soon changed that by using a rotavator to cultivate the lawn, and then I oversowed with a wildflower mix. Over the years, I've introduced additional species into this area. So for example, field scabious, and also wild parsnip, betony. And so over here, we then have the wildlife pond, which has been in for 6 years now. And really great, within 6 months of putting that in, great crested newts turned up. Also a whole variety of other species, including the great diving beetle, the water boatman. And then around the pond, we also have this buffer strip. And this is to provide protection for species which are utilised in that pond. So the dragonfly nymphs, when they come up to emerge as those adults, they need to be able to climb out onto vegetation to then pupate into that adult. Wherever you live, whatever outdoor space you have, there is always something that you can do. And my sort of ethos on all of this is that where we all live was once a wild natural habitat. And so I guess there is that onus on us to put something back. So regardless of the size of your outdoor space, putting in even small areas of wildflowers, even individual plants of your favourite wildflowers, is a really good approach, because every plant you put in is going to support some species.
I think what Duncan's garden shows is that not only is wildlife something that we all want to look after and nurture, or even that it's good for the garden, because it is. There's a real trade-off there. But also, really importantly, it looks beautiful too. And I think the orchard is quite a good example, because we have planted a lot of bulbs. We've got the tulips now coming up, we've got alliums, we've had daffodils, there will be camassias coming through, and this is all in amongst naturally sown lesser hogweed and the cow parsley and the long grass. And establishing and maintaining that balance is good fun, and I think it looks beautiful too. Now, still to come on today's programme. Arit finds out how a government ban on the use of peat in bags of compost next year is going to affect all aspects of horticulture.
I still have some concerns whether there will be 100% availability next year of alternatives, but I think we're there or thereabouts.
And we return to Glebe Cottage, where Carol is preparing her show garden.
So as you walk in through here, you'll see all this beautiful meadow, loads and loads of wonderful perennials and grasses, and over here is your Moor Mountain bit.
But first we're going to visit one of your gardens, and it belongs to Jane Denham in York.
Hi, I'm Jane. Welcome to my garden. We used to have a lawn which I've hated for years and decided to dig up. It was always muddy, always weedy, and it wasn't a good lawn. So what I did was I dug the whole thing up and planted it mainly with tulips the first year, and then the second year I've softened it a bit more to go with the rest of my garden, which is also a wildlife garden. And this year I've put some more of the species tulips in and wallflowers to follow those. This is the bed that my husband made for us. It's made out of steel and it's filled with compost and re-topped up every year. Later on, I will remove some of the wallflowers and this honesty and put some dahlias in and some nicotiana or anything else that I've grown, and then again repeat next year. Just remember, you don't need a lawn. If you don't like it, dig it up. That's my advice. Thanks, Monty. Bye.
I'm inclined to agree with you, Jane, but on the other hand, if you don't want to dig up your lawn, let it grow long. That's also a good option. And the truth is, if you want an immaculate lawn, then that's fine, but choose it. Don't just think a lawn has to be there because that's what gardens have. You can do almost anything with a lawn and suit it to your own taste. Now, here in the writing garden, I've been making changes. Originally, this was created and planted to try and capture the spirit of cow parsley, because I love the way that cow parsley, with these white umbels of flowers, just floats on this frothy green foliage. And I thought if I could continue that across the seasons so that the flowers would float and dance above the stems, predominantly white, then that would make me very happy. But gradually the shrubs I planted got too big and began to dominate, and I seemed to lose that spirit. So last autumn, I took out a lot of the shrubs, started to add more umbellifers, and that's the process I'm continuing now. And I'm starting with a couple of lovages. Now, one is herb lovage, which I've moved from the herb garden. It can grow to about 8 foot tall, topped by slightly yellowy umbels of flower. And this is a plant which I've never grown before, but it's Scottish lovage, and is a perennial and should be rather interesting. Umbellifers are all plates of flowers, in fact florets, many florets, which are brilliant for insects. Now I've got another one which I've moved from the herb garden. This is Sweet Cicely, and that stays fairly low. It has leaves that smell and taste of licorice. It used to be used as a kind of sugar alternative, and this will grow quite well in shade, so I can put this at the back of the border. Now this, again, is a plant that I've not grown before, but I've always wanted to. Baltic parsley. It's perennial with white umbels, sort of June, July, August time. And these will all grow in light shade as well as sun. I'd like to pretend that it's only years of accumulated knowledge and experience that enables me to plant. The truth is, nothing could be simpler. Make a hole in the ground, stick them in it. Just make sure you've got the height of the top of the container the same height as the top of the soil, and that really is all you have to do. So that can go in there like that. What's exciting is these plants will, I believe, get back to everything that I wanted from this bit of the garden. And over the years, I've learned that you start out with really good intentions and clever choices of plants. You look after them well, you do everything right, but it won't last. It will change. Some plants will take over, some plants will die back, some plants won't adapt as well as others. And so you have to keep changing and adapting and monitoring it too. And rather than that being a depressing process, I think it's what gardening's about. Now, all these plants I know have been grown in a peat-free compost. And the government, as of next year, is banning the sale of peat in composts to gardeners. And this is still a subject that is hotly debated. And ARIT has been to see the implications and consequences of this debate.
Peat bogs cover nearly 12% of the UK, and apart from being a diverse habitat for wildlife, they play a vital role in locking up carbon, combating climate change and preventing flooding. For a long time, peat has been extracted in the UK and imported for the horticultural industry. Because it not only holds water, it drains well and is an ideal medium to retain nutrients. bags of compost containing peat have been available to buy in garden centres and supermarkets for decades. But that is set to change. In England, the government is going to introduce new legislation to end all sales of peat to amateur gardeners in 2024, and Wales and Scotland look set to follow suit. Our reliance on peat has come at a huge cost, a cost that is less about money and more about the impact on our environment. It takes 1,000 years for decaying vegetation that has become waterlogged to form a metre of peat, locking up carbon in the process. It's estimated that, incredibly, peat bogs worldwide store more carbon than all of the world's forests. But damage due to human activity means many are believed to be a source of emissions rather than a carbon sink. While the industry's reliance on peat has reduced, for Mark Blake from the Somerset Wildlife Trust, a ban can't come soon enough.
An undamaged bog is really important when it comes to greenhouse gases. It can sequester carbon through photosynthesis of mosses and other peatland plant species, removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it into the ground. If we continue to dig peat out of the ground for horticultural purposes, we are contributing to millions of tonnes of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases being emitted. This, in turn, is going to encourage the changes we're seeing in our climate. That's going to make it so much more difficult for us to grow the plants in our gardens that we want to grow, that we're used to growing. Things do need to change. We need to keep peat in the ground, not in a bag.
The government set a voluntary target in 2011 to the horticultural industry to phase out the use of peat in bags of compost by 2020. That failed, and a ban is now on the way in 2024. This will radically affect what we use and how we use it. But the transition to peat-free may not be easy. Believe it or not, we gardeners use around the same amount of peat as the entire horticultural industry. If by next year we have to use alternatives to peat, the big question is, will there be enough to keep up with supply and demand?
In terms of preparation for next year, then I think the retail sector is well positioned. I still have some concerns whether there will be 100% availability next year of alternatives, but I think we're there or thereabouts. I think what's coming through now is very good for the gardener. In terms of alternatives, they are multi and varied. The three big ones are wood chip. After that, it's coir. And then there's a whole variety of different green wastes. And all have their own particular nature, their particular nutrients, and how they're put together is pretty fundamental to how the end product works.
With a ban on the way, the pressure is on. In the past, the quality of peat-free compost has been variable. But Professor Alistair Griffiths, who leads the science and collections team at the Royal Horticultural Society, is a man on a mission to show gardeners all that's changed. So some of the newer composts, these peat-free composts, are they good? Because sometimes they haven't had good results.
There are lots of new peat-free growing medias out there that are significantly shifted with science input into them, which means that they can still grow very good quality plants for us gardeners.
It can sometimes be confusing to know how to use peat-free compost in our gardens, but Alistair has some tips on using the right growing mediums for our beds and borders. Thanks for the knee pads, Alistair, getting me in these borders. But first things first, let's be clear about the different types of medium we should be using when putting our lovely plants in. What should we be using?
Basically, it's soil improvement. And so what we need is there's a selection of products that we can use, some of which are already in your garden. So this is leaf mould. It's really rich. So when you put this stuff on, it keeps the moisture in. All our leaf material and our vegetation
Yeah.
here at Wisley is composted.
With a small garden like I have, you know, composting is about spacing. Can it still be a small space to create compost?
Yeah, so you can use some of these like tiny hot boxes, you can create that. But if you can't do that, then go to your local council, because they'll have green waste and areas, or then look at buying soil improvers.
Okay, so it's important, isn't it, that the compost, the actual compost that you buy in the garden centre is not to be used on the borders. It's got to be the soil improvers, homemade compost, leaf mould. That's what we need.
Yeah.
So, if we need to avoid using bags of peat-free compost on our beds as a mulch, when is it useful? Nikki Barker is a soil expert at the RHS who knows the tricks of the trade for using it in our pots and trays of seedlings.
So it's best to use peat-free compost, but you can use loam-based compost as well. You can get other sort of peat-free seed composts that are a mixture of coir and composted bark. This is growing media.
I guess we've all got to think about ways of how we can reduce our compost footprint. What are some of the ways that we can do that?
Well, some of the easiest ways to do that are thinking about using cell trays and smaller cells. Not only do you use less compost, 1 pot full of compost will fill 6 of those cells, and probably 3 or 4 in these larger cells as well. So if you're pricking out, you immediately are using less compost.
I'm a real container girl, Nikki, so what should I be using in those containers?
I think the best thing you can do, and we all still like growing annuals, they're such a lovely colour, aren't they? But when they've finished, and that compost's spent, really, they've taken a lot of the nutrient and goodness out of it, put that compost on your compost heap. And then that will rot down and you're putting it back on your borders and you're adding to the whole cycle of life there.
Yeah.
And then you can buy a good quality peat-free compost to start again this year with your annuals. And with the permanent planting, just liquid feeding, really, and just add a little bit of compost every few years just to refresh it.
Yeah. Watering peat-free compost can be tricky to judge because different composts have different compositions. Little and often is one rule of thumb, and Nikki has another tip.
People often overwater because they're treating it the same as they treated peat-based compost. It holds water well, but it will often look drier on the top. So actually you really do need to stick your finger in and see what it's like further down, and usually it's got quite a good well, and it should feel slightly moist at the base. Because they've got composted bark in them, as that composting process happens, they've got really good beneficial fungi in them.
Yeah.
But people go, oh my God, there's fungus there. There's little toadstools. Just pick them off, they won't hurt you at all, and chuck them, and all of the beneficial mycorrhizae that's still in the soil is really good for your plant's roots. So don't worry about the toadstools at all. It's really fine.
Okay. What is so encouraging is that there are many practical ways that we can reduce our compost footprint, save money, and as gardeners really know that we can make an impact on the environment whilst still celebrating our gardens.
I'm really glad that the point was made that if you get little toadstools on the surface of your potting compost, particularly if it's bark-based compost, that's nothing to worry about. I know people somehow feel that all signs of fungi are potentially a problem for plants, but the vast majority of fungus living in the soil are actually beneficial. And ARIT will be following this up with other aspects of the whole peat issue. Now, I've got an issue of my own here. These are oranges and lemons, and last winter we stored them in the bus shelter in the Paradise Garden and put up a very heavily insulated screen, which we opened daily to let air in. Well, we had a cold snap in December, and then overnight the temperature dropped to -14. and that was disastrous. And you can see the state of my citrus. They look terrible, absolutely devastated. The other thing was they then showed signs of fungal infection. Now, I said most fungi are good. Some fungi aren't. And the fungus feeds off the dead wood. So the wood is killed by the cold and then the fungus feeds off it. So if you've experienced this, you can remedy the situation. So the first thing to do is to cut out the dead wood. So let's take this plant here, which looks as though it's on its last legs. So it's just taking out the damaged wood. So we're going to cut this out like this. This is dead right down to here. So we'll cut that there. Now it is very important when you have a plant stricken in winter that you don't overwater it, because that will encourage fungus. So as with all citrus at this time of year, even if they're very healthy, give them a good soak and then leave them until they dry out again. When you've cut them back, bring them somewhere light and warm, and that's really important. The more warmth they have and the more light they have, the quicker they will recover. Give them a soak, maybe give them a seaweed feed, and then let them get on with it. So don't write any plant off just because part of it is dead. Right, I will start to tackle this one. And while I'm doing this, let's pay another visit to Glebe Cottage and see how Carol's preparations for Hampson are progressing.
Well, so far, when I've been trying to envisage this garden, all I've got to go on is my plan and that beautiful artist's impression. And I really want to try and understand the scale of it, so I'm going to measure it out. This is the biggest sort of bit of open ground we've got. I've got to go through the greenhouse too. So I'm going to measure it out, and I reckon one of my strides is about 1 metre. So that's 3, 4, 5, 11, 12, 13, 14, 22, 23, 24, 25. That's it. Look at that, it's vast. It's absolutely huge. But that gives me an idea of the sort of scale of it, but I want to put a bit of detail in. So from here, I'm going to lay this hose out right the way round to give me some real idea of the shape of it, but I need a hand. And Neil's a real expert with the hose pipe. Of course, when you're doing this, you must always have a completely untangled hose pipe.
Did you get your foot on that?
Oh, there's an end, right. So that goes in more of a curve there, Neil. Thanks, love. With most show gardens, they're rectangular. They've got straight edges and right angles. But I want to do an oval because I think it's a much more friendly shape. And also, imagine you're a spectator on the outside of a garden. So if you can walk right the way round like this, you still feel part of it. And then just here, you can go into the centre. So as you walk in, you'll see all this beautiful meadow, loads and loads of wonderful perennials and grasses, and over here is your more mountain bit. And then as you walk through here and follow this curving path, lo and behold, there's a woodland piece. Now I know this is rather a crude rendition of what it's going to be like, but this is the only piece in the whole garden that's really high. Come here, come here, come here. This is the path. Yeah, this is the path. That's it, that's how it goes. She's got the idea anyway. I'm really getting quite excited, but I am slightly taken aback by the scale of the thing. In an ideal world, I would love to have grown everything myself, but I would have needed years to do that, and I've had months. So, instead of that, as well as growing a few things myself, I bought loads of plants in. A friend of mine, Jamie Butterworth, is bringing them all together from different nurseries, good British nurseries.
To be approached by Carol, to be entrusted with a project of this significance, of this magnitude, and for her to be putting her passion, her love, her desire that is so infectious into a garden that everybody can see is going to be amazing, and I'm delighted to be involved.
It's lovely to see you.
Nice to see you too, Carol. How are you?
I'd rather have the real thing, but this'll do for now. So how's my plants? I've just been telling everybody about your many talents.
We've built a very special Carol Klein pen, so all your plants are in their own special pen, being lovingly grown on.
Carol's Corral, yeah?
I like it.
Yeah. Now, so far you've got how many? A couple of thousand, or?
I think we've got about 1,000 here so far, and then we've got another 4,000 still to come in, to be potted on, to grow on. And obviously we've got about 10 weeks or so left of growing.
You're making me nervous. It's lovely to see you and see the progress that's being made. And can I come and see for myself in a couple of weeks?
Please do, Carol. Can't wait to show you your plants and see what you think. To have the pressure of growing Carol's plants for her garden is quite scary, but we're up for the challenge, and I think it'll be really exciting.
I sort of go from, on the one hand, feeling really inspired and really keen and, you know, and optimistic about everything. And then in the middle of the night, I wake up and I think, you know what? I can't do this. It's just so huge. It's such an enormous project. And then I talk to people about it, and everybody is so encouraging, and everybody else seems to believe it's going to happen. And I do too.
Of course you can do it, Carol. And you'll do it better than anyone. Can't wait to see it. This is a job which we do every year, taking the dahlias out of store and potting them up so we can grow them on before planting them out after the last frost. And in fact, I've got one here that I potted up in early March to use as cuttings, and you can see the sort of size that it is, and that's the size that I want to plant them out, which for these should be round about Chelsea time. And over the years we've tried many ways of storing them, but now we use newspaper. We have kept them in sand and in old compost and vermiculite and perlite, but wrapped in newspaper, stored in these trays in a cool, dark, frost-free place seems to work really well. And I don't know if you can see that there's a tiny little growth bud there, which shows it wants to grow. If there are any rotting or very shriveled up tubers, you remove them at this stage. And I use recycled pots. So I keep old pots and just take one that's roughly the right sort of size. That's about the right size. So I'm going to use just normal compost. You don't need to add any goodness. They're not going to stay in here very long, and most of the nutrition will be supplied by the tubers. You can use a bit of recycled compost if you've got some that's relatively fresh. But if it's been around, it was used last summer and around all winter, don't use it. Put that on the compost heap. That will get rid of the risk of any viruses or problems. We'll just pop that in there like that. And these bits and pieces that might fall off, just pop in too. And they will develop roots and grow with it. Cover it up. Put the label in, water it, and then put it somewhere bright but frost-free. And keep it moist, don't let it dry out completely, and you'll find that shoots will appear very quickly and it will grow fast. Right, I have got a lot of these to do. So while I'm getting stuck into this, here are some jobs for you this weekend. If you grow cosmos from seed, they may well have developed, like mine, into rather elongated young plants. The thing to do is to cut or pinch them back to a strong pair of leaves. And this will encourage side shoots and bushy plants that will bear lots of flowers. The secret of a constant supply of fresh salad leaves is succession, which means sowing and planting little and often. If you've got your own young plants, that's great, but if not, you can buy them from a garden centre. In either case, plant them out at about 8 or 9 inch spacing in a grid or in rows. Keep them watered and weeded, and they should be ready to harvest in 4 to 5 weeks' time. Late flowering clematis, like Clematis viticella, will now be growing very vigorously indeed, but it does tend to sprawl and fall all over the place. So tie it up regularly. Use a soft twine so it doesn't cut into the young growth, and repeat this every week for about the next month until it develops its own tendrils, which means it's self-supporting. Although there's so much to do in the garden at this time of year, I do try and make myself stop and relish the moment because it's so fleeting. And here in the Paradise Garden, we've got the blossom starting to open out. Soon this will be a cloud of white. But right now, the stars of the show are these acuminata tulips. These are the long, wispy petaled ones. And I chose them because they are like the tulips you see on the 16th century tiles in the palace in Istanbul. And the whole point of these paradise gardens is that they are places of rest, somewhere to come and relax and fill your senses. But that's it for today. We'll see you again next week, but at the later time of 9 o'clock. See you then. Bye-bye.